Have you ever thought about what you could do when all that remains is pain? I know it sounds like a difficult question, but today, I will tell you a story that few know, stored in the shadows of the American past. Among the walls of a mansion in Charleston, a woman named Sarah carried secrets that even the devil herself dared to pronounce. What happened that Easter morning of 1832 has forever transformed the meaning of the word justice into South Carolina plantations. Many talk about rebellion, but what Sarah has transcended any common definition of resistance. If you enjoy real stories that reveal the dark side of humanity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. I assure you that after knowing the details of this case, you will never look at a cup of tea the same way. Let's dive into a story that school books never had the courage to tell. The ruins of the Silverwood plantation remain to this day around Charleston, partially swallowed by South Carolina's swamps. The smell of moss and standing water still hangs in the air when the sun sets, as if the earth kept the memory of the horrors lived there. In the wreckage of the old kitchen, the places say that on full moon nights it is possible to hear the soft tilint of spoons against porcelain, followed by muffled shouts that no one can explain. It was in this exact place that Sarah, a 34-year-old slave, showed that there is no oppression that can completely break the human spirit, nor prevent justice from finding her way, even through the hands of those who have been systematically dehumanized. The history I bring today does not celebrate violence, but reveals the depth of human despair when all dignity is torn, when each right is denied, when each family bond is destroyed in the name of profit and institutionalized cruelty. Silverwood soil has witnessed one of the most meticulous revenge ever recorded in American history, executed with the precise patience of those who learned to wait in the shadows, observing, learning, and planning. A single woman who, with nothing but her knowledge of herbs and plants, faced a brutal system and wrote her name with letters that even time was not able to erase. If you want to follow more cases like this, which move with all society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. Plantation Silverwood was a 3,500 colossus across rivers and streams fueled by Cooper River. In the endless fields, more than 200 slaves bowed their backs under the ruthless sun of South Carolina, harvesting cotton, rice, and tobacco that transformed Colonel William Thornfield into the richest man in the region. The large house, built in Georgian style, sported white columns that rose as merciless sentries, watching the property that stretched to the horizon. Within that small empire, the hierarchy was as rigid as the currents in the ankles of newly arrived slaves. Colonel Thornfield commanded all from the top of his porch, while the foreman James Hadley performed his orders with the crack of a whip that never seemed to rest. The always armed overseers ran through the fields as vultures, ready to descend on any sign of disobedience. For slaves, the day started long before the sun appeared. The big bell of the campanaria played at 4 in the morning, pulling them out of tight barracks where they slept on straw mats over the dirt floor. After a miserable meal of cornmeal, they went to the fields where they remained, until the darkness made it impossible to see what they harvested. The children did not escape. From the age of 5, they carried water to the adults. At 8, they were already working on the harvest. The control instruments were as varied as cruel. In the central courtyard, trunks, pelorinos, and shackles remained in sight of everyone, as a constant memory of what awaited the disobedient. In the Casa de Castigos, strategically located so that everyone could hear the screams, the examples were made with refinements of cruelty. The worst, however, was the iron of marking, warm until it turned red, which printed the initials WT in the skin of those trying to escape. The sounds of that place told stories without words: the crawl of the beaded ox cars, the constant zunit of the whip cutting the air, the chains dragged by the newest captives, the moans muffled at night in the barracks, and sometimes the silent cry of women returning from the big house after being called by the colonel or their guests. In the summer months, the relentless heat turned Silverwood into an open-air oven, where the air seemed too heavy to breathe. In the corners of the property, the swamps exuded putrid vapors that brought fevers and diseases that Colonel Raramantroy spent money to treat. Cheaper to replace than medicate, was his known motto. In that spring of 1832, something different hovered in the air beyond the perfume of the jasmine that adorned the big house. Older slaves felt, like animals that present a storm. Something was about to happen at Silverwood. something that would start at the heart of the kitchen and spread as a silent poison through the veins of the plantation. Among the Silverwood plantation slaves, Sarah occupied a unique and dangerous position. Born on his own farm, the daughter of a domestic slave with knowledge of medicinal herbs, Sarah inherited not only her mother's talent, but widened it through careful observation and sharp intelligence that learned to hide under an appearance of submission. Sarah was not only the main cook of Casa Grande, but also responsible for the medicinal herbal garden that supplied both the plantation pharmacy and the kitchen. His hands knew the exact point of the spice that pleased Colonel Thornfield's demanding taste, the ideal temperature to prepare the medicines they treated from Mrs. Thornfield to seasonal fevers that affected the slaves of the fields. This position granted Sarah a rare privilege: traffic. His knowledge was requested both in the great house, where he served the Thornfield family meals, and in the slave barracks, where many resorted to their potions and poultices when white doctors refused to serve them. Sarah moved between these two worlds like a shadow, watching, absorbing, and memorizing. Sarah's confidence has gained over the years was her most powerful weapon. Colonel Thornfield himself, a man who distrusted even his own shadow, was completely surrendered to the dishes prepared by his hands. "Sarah knows my stomach better than me," he was boasting to the guests during the sumptuous dinners he offered. The two daughters of Colonel Elizabeth and Catherine, 18 and 16, did not dispense with the special teas that Sarah prepared to calm the nerves before the balls of Charleston society. In a few mornings, it was possible to see Sarah carefully preparing the breakfast tray for the Thornfield family, her face a dedicated mask of servitude, while her dark eyes recorded every detail: who ate what, which foods were favorite of each family member, which herbs caused which reactions. At night in the barracks, these same hands kindly apply ointments on the back sealed by the whip, while his lips whispered words of comfort that kept the flame of hope among the other slaves. The paradox that defined Sarah was precisely this: the more he was faithfully served, the more power accumulated. The more he knew about the life and habits of his oppressors, the more dangerous he became. Under the appearance of perfect submission, he kept the secret knowledge that would once transform the established order of Silverwood irreversibly. Leave in the comments, never give up the truth, if you believe justice must reach all the oppressed. Silverwood horrors were not isolated events, but continuous growing atrocities that fed on impunity. Earlier that year, the 15-year-old Elijah was flogged to death for looking straight into Elizabeth Thornfield's eyes when she gave her an order. His body was left hanging in the center of the courtyard for 2 days as lesson. Weeks later, little Martha, a 9-year-old slave that served as a companion of Catherine Thornfield, had her right hand dived into boiling water because she accidentally broke a porcelain cup. The cries of the child echoed through the big house, while Catherine herself held her arm in the cauldron, arguing that she needed to learn to value fine things. When 3 slaves tried to escape during a summer storm, they were hunted with dogs and brought back. Colonel Thornfield ordered an exemplary punishment. They had the tendons of Achilles cut before they were returned to work in the fields. "Now they can try to run," the foreman mocked as the men dragged on the mud. Between each horror and the following, Sarah watched. It served the meals where the colonel and his guests discussed new forms of discipline. He cleaned the blood of the large house marble floors after the punishments administered inside. He prepared compresses for the slaves who returned from the night visits to the rooms of white men of the property, often carrying marks of violence that went far beyond the violation of their bodies. With each new atrocity, something changed in Sarah's eyes. What was once a spark of silent resistance was slowly turned into a cold and calculating determination. On the nights, alone in his small room at the back of the kitchen, privilege granted by its position, Sarah began to mentally register each horror, every name, every face. It was not just isolated events, but links of a chain that one day she would use to strangle her own system that had forged her. While his hands worked automatically, kneading bread or stirring hells, his mind metalligously cataloged the natural poisons that grew in the swamps around Silverwood, which caused rapid death, which induced prolonged suffering, which could be confused with natural diseases. Knowledge was your weapon, and patience your shield. The breakpoint for Sarah did not come with a great dramatic event, but with a succession of little daily cruelties that finally overflowed the cup of its tolerance. And when finally came, There was no screams or tears, just a silent decision that would forever change everyone's fate in Silverwood. For Sarah, the world collapsed on an autumn afternoon when her younger sister Rebecca, 28, was selected to be sold. Rebecca, a skilled weaver, had attracted the attention of a New Orleans buyer who offered a considerable sum. Having a 3-year-old son in Silverwood did not weigh on Colonel Thornfield's decision, who saw only the numbers in the accounting books. When Sarah learned, she ran to the fields where Rebecca worked. He found her kneeling between the cotton baskets, fixed eyes on the empty, already delivered to the inevitability of her destiny. "My little Isaiah, who will take care of him when I leave?" she murmured, the voice devoid of emotion, as if her soul had already abandoned the body. That night Sarah got permission to visit her sister in the shed, where slaves in transit were waiting. It took a small bundle with bread and some dried meat I had managed to dodge the kitchen. In the suffocating silence of the cubicle, the sisters hugged for the last time. Rebecca took out of her neck a small amulet, made of colorful accounts and intertwined roots, heritage of her African grandmother. "So you may remember who we are," he whispered, placing him in Sarah's hands. "Take care of Isaiah. Don't let you forget my face." Sarah didn't cry, not even when the buyer came to Rebecca the next morning, not even when he had to hold little Isaiah who struggled trying to run after the wagon that drove his mother. Not even when, weeks later, I learned from a messenger that Rebecca had tried to flee on the road to New Orleans and had been slaughtered like an animal. Instead of tears, Sarah made a private ritual. On the first night of the new moon after receiving the news, he went to an isolated corner of the swamp. There, away from the vigilant eyes, lit 3 small candles made of beeswax who had patiently collected. One by Rebecca, one by Isaiah, now orphan, and one for itself. Faced with hesitating flames, Sarah took a silent oath. There would be no shouts of revenge or grandiose promises, only the absolute certainty that the Thornfield family would pay equally for the suffering it had caused. With Rebecca's amulet tight in his hand, Sarah sealed her promise with 3 drops of her own blood that dropped on the damp earth. When he returned to plantation, something had changed. The other slaves realized immediately. In his eyes before full of pain contained, now there was only a calculated coldness. Sarah had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The cruelty in Silverwood did not have a single face, but many, a hydra whose heads regenerated and multiplied over time. At the top of the horror pyramid was Colonel William Thornfield, a man whose brutality was masked by the elegance of his imported clothes and educated ways. Descendant of one of South Carolina's first colonizing families, Thornfield had the sadism refined for the years and legitimized by tradition. His pleasure was not in public whip, although he ordered them regularly, but in psychological torture, in the elaborate humiliation, in the systematic destruction of any sense of identity between his slaves. His wife, Augusta Thornfield, expressed his cruelty through cold indifference. While drinking tea on the porch, she could watch a whip without a single wrinkle disturbing her porcelain face. "They are like animals," he used to comment casually. "They don't feel pain like us." The couple's daughters, Elizabeth and Catherine, had learned their parents' lessons well. Elizabeth, the oldest, was known for her sharp language and creative punishments that inflicted on domestic slaves. Catherine, the youngest, hid her cruelty to a sweet look, but she was often the one who suggested the most severe punishments, as if testing the boundaries of the power she would inherit. The foreman James Hadley complemented the antagonist framework. Former prisoner hired specifically by his brutalid ADE, Hadley brought in his face marked by scars the map of his own violence. His whip, made especially with 9 strips of leather straps interspersed with small pieces of metal, was known as the educator among slaves. It was a specific event, however, that served as the final catalyst for Sarah's plans. During a routine inspection in the kitchen, Catherine Thornfield accused Sarah of stealing refined sugar, a crime she had not committed. With no chance of defense, Sarah was taken to the central courtyard where the colonel himself decided to make an example. Faced with all the forcibly gathered slaves, the colonel announced, "This woman abused the trust of this house. He ate from our table, slept under our ceiling, and returned with theft. Today, he will learn the price of ingratitude. Sarah was tied to a post. Instead of the traditional whip, the colonel ordered every domestic slave, every person who knew Sarah in person, applying a blow. To remember where your loyalty resides, he explained with a polite smile. One by one, forced by the threat of worse punishment, those who had shared confidences with Sarah, who had received their help at times of illness, had to wield the whip. Some cried silently, others looked away. Little Isaiah, Sarah's nephew, was forced to watch the front row. When they finally released it, hours later, Sarah was no longer the same person. Something fundamental had broken. Not his spirit, but the last ties that attached it to any concept of mercy or forgiveness. While the other slaves took care of their wounds, she remained absolutely silent, her eyes fixed in the empty. That night, lying on his treadmill, every breath an exercise of agony, Sarah made her final decision. The plan that was formulating for months crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. It wouldn't be an open escape or rebellion. It would be much more sophisticated, much more devastating. Something worthy of the herbal expert who had learned to hide his knowledge under the mask of servitude. The public humiliation suffered by Sarah became the last drop of water from a chalice already overflowing with injustices. After being whipped by her own captive companions, she was dragged to the punishment house, a small stone building next to the stables where the examples were kept in the sight of all. There, on the damp floor covered by a thin layer of dirty straw, Sarah spent 3 days without food, just with enough water to keep her alive. The smell of mold mingled with the ferrous odor of the blood that still drained from his lacerated backs. Rats ran through the darkness, occasionally approaching to investigate if he was dead. The sensation on your skin was like constant fire, each wound pulsating into the rhythm of its weakened heart. The salt that Foreman Hadley had spread over the cuts to prevent infection, an euphemism to intensify pain, still burned as if it was just applied. The muscles of his body were involuntarily contracted in periodic spasms, reaction to the physical trauma he had suffered. The hot, stagnant air of the cell made it difficult to breathe. Each inspiration was shallow and painful, the minimum movement of its thoracic box sufficient to reopen partially coagulated wounds. On the cell walls, scratch marks and inscriptions left by previous occupants told silent stories of despair. It was in this environment of absolute degradation that Sarah's final transformation took place. There was no unique moment of epiphany, but a slow crystallization of the will that was forming time after hour in darkness. His body could be broken, but his mind became clearer with every moment of agony. When the cell door finally opened on the morning of the 4th day, the woman who emerged looked like the same Sarah as usual in her eyes. Head low, curved shoulders, eyes on the floor, the perfect posture of submission. But anyone who looked more closely would notice something different in the bottom of his eyes. Where before there was pain and fear contained, there was only a calculating emptiness, cold like the bottom of an abandoned well. "Do you learn your lesson, slave?" asked the foreman Hadley, holding his chin tight to force her to look at him. "Yes, Master Hadley," Sarah replied low. "I learned well." And in fact I had learned, not the lesson they intended to teach, but a very different. While escorted back to the kitchen, where they hoped to immediately resume their duties despite their open wounds, Sarah made her definitive decision. The Thornfield family would die. Not quickly or mercifully, but in a calculated and symbolic way. The first thing he did when he returned to the kitchen was to light the fire. Not only the physical fire in the great wood stove, but also the cold flame of revenge that now burned constant in its heart, as controlled and accurate as the temperatures I used to prepare the most complex dishes for the Thornfield table. In the following days, while working in silence, moving with the difficulty of who carries deep wounds, Sarah began to mentally elaborate every detail of her plan. Death would come during the celebration of Easter, Renaissance Festival, and Fresh Start. A choice not only practical, but poetically appropriate. Sarah's revenge planning was not born of an emotional impulse, but from a methodical analysis worthy of a military strategist. Isolated in her small room at the back of the kitchen, slowly recovering from her wounds, she began to map each element required for her plan. The choice of accomplices was its first and most delicate decision. Sarah understood that many arms would make the work fail, while few chosen would guarantee accuracy and confidentiality. After weeks of careful observation, he selected only 3 people: Tobias, an old coachman who knew each escape path in the region; Mercy, a young domestic slave who worked directly with her daughters Thornfield and had access to her rooms; and Jeremiah, a field slave Sarah could keep silent hatred since his wife had been sold. On a moonless night, they gathered at the small slave cemetery at the back of the property, a place rarely visited by whites, due to the superstitions they themselves had created about African spirits. There, among tombs marked only by brute stones, Sarah exposed her plan. Each of us has a specific function, and each function is vital as an organ of the body, Sarah explained, his voice little more than a whisper. Failing means death for all of us. To succeed means freedom. The division of tasks was meticulously established. Tobias would be responsible for guaranteeing the escape means, secretly preparing a wagon and gathering supplies for the trip to the north. Mercy, with her access to family quarters, would collect information about the night habits and collect small personal effects needed for the plan. Jeremiah, in turn, would be the messenger between them and the external contacts Tobias kept with the clandestine network of helping fugitive slaves. Plantation mapping was the next step. For weeks, Sarah mentally documented every relevant detail: the rotation of the night guards, the times when the big house was more vulnerable, the blind spots on the patrol routes. He created such an accurate mental model that he could navigate Silverwood with his eyes closed. The necessary resources were cataloged and slowly gathered. Sarah began to collect and dry certain herbs and roots of her medicinal garden, claiming need for drugs for the approaching flu. Small amounts of critical ingredients were diverted from the kitchen and hidden in unlikely places: a little sugar in the lining of their mattress, essences concentrated in small vials buried in the garden. The date chosen for the execution of the plan was not arbitrary. Easter in Silverwood was traditionally marked by a large feast where Colonel Thornfield displayed his wealth and Christian generosity for selected guests from Charleston's high society. It was also one of the rare occasions when slaves received a special meal and a few hours of rest, creating the perfect environment for what Sarah planned. She named her plan the Last Supper, bitter reference to the Christian celebration that her oppressors professed to follow as they violated every moral principle of their own faith. The name has never been pronounced aloud, remaining as a shared secret through looks among the conspirators. The countdown started 8 weeks before Easter. In brief and apparently casual meetings, the 4 refined every detail of the plan. Sarah created a daily task-based communication system: the way an outfit was hanging in the clothesline, the position of a bucket of water, the number of knocking on the kitchen door, allowing them to exchange information without lifting suspicions. As the date approached, Sarah kept an outdoor calm that disconcerted even the other slaves. Her hands worked with the usual accuracy, preparing the family meals that had sworn to destroy, serving them with the perfect deference expected of her. No one, looking into his impassive face, could imagine that behind that mask of servitude, a storm formed, accurate, calculated, and inevitable as death itself. On the eve of Easter 1832, 2 worlds coexisted in Silverwood Plantation, separated by an abyss of power and knowledge. In the big house, excitement grew with preparations for the big banquet the next day. In the areas of slaves, a silent tension hovered in the air, felt but not understood by the majority. Inside the Thornfield mansion, created from side to side under Mrs. Augusta's rigorous supervision, who inspected every detail of the preparations with critical look. In the dining room, the long mahogany table was already set with the English porcelain reserved for special occasions. Crystals imported from Bohemian captured the light of the chandelier, projecting small rainbows on the imported wallpaper walls. Elizabeth and Catherine Thornfield spent the afternoon experimenting with new dresses brought especially from Charleston for the occasion. Its sharp laughs echoed through the corridors as they debated which color would best complement their light skins, and which jewelry would impress the single children of neighboring plantains who would be present. In the office, Colonel Thornfield finished business with 2 cotton traders, proudly displaying the accounting books that demonstrated the growing profitability of Silverwood. "Tomorrow we celebrate not only the resurrection of our Lord," he said, lifting a glass of brandy, but also the prosperity he has given to those who can manage his gifts. In a direct contrast, a few meters away, in the mansion's kitchen, Sarah orchestrated a very different symphony. Her hands moved with mechanical accuracy while preparing pasta, cutting vegetables, and supervised the roasted roasts that would be marinating at night. Under his direction, other cuisine slaves worked in respectful silence, unconsciously responding to the contained intensity emanating from it. In a reserved corner of the pantry, protected by piles of flour bags, Sarah had created a small makeshift sanctuary. There, when she got some moments of privacy, she made preparations that had nothing to do with the Paschal banquet. Small amounts of carefully measured post were transferred to tiny ceramic containers, labeled only in your mind. A special bottle containing a transparent liquid distilled with roots collected at the marshes remained hidden in a secret cavity that had created under a loose board. In the stables, Tobias carefully verified the axes of the smaller cart, the one rarely used since the purchase of the new family coach. Under the pretext of performing preventive maintenance, he reinforced the wheels and hid small supplies, fine blankets, a water canteen, hard bread, in secret compartments that had patiently built over the months. In the slaves' lodging, Jeremiah sat silent in his treadmill, methodically sharpened a small work knife until his blade shone like a mirror. Others ignored him, used to his silence since the sale of his wife. Mercy, in turn, moved as a shadow through the girls of the young Thornfield, getting dressed and organizing jewelry while memorizing the exact location of each object. His young face kept the proper expression of a diligent servant, but his eyes recorded every detail with the accuracy of a cartographer. The sounds of that night composed an audible montage of two parallel realities. In the big house, laughs, piano music played by Catherine, crystal Tylent, and the constant murmur of carefree conversations. In the housing of slaves, the heavy silence occasionally broken by the muffled cry of children, Jeremiah's rhythmic sound sharpening his blade, and the tired sighs of those who knew that the next day, despite being a holiday, would bring only a variation of everyday work. As the night advanced, small signs were exchanged between the four conspirators. Tobias passed through the kitchen to check if it would be necessary to prepare the coach to search for guests the next day, leaving a small piece of rope with 3 nodes on the table, a sign that the external preparations were complete. Mercy, when collecting dirty kitchen clothes, positioned a specifically apron on the clothesline, indicating that daughters Thornfield had confirmed that they would use their new French perfumes the next day, crucial element for Sarah's plan. Around midnight, when the large house finally silenced, Sarah remained alone in the kitchen, claiming the need to finish preparations for Paschal breakfast. In fact, this was the moment it had reserved for the most delicate stage of its plan. With the accuracy of an apothecary, Sarah mixed small amounts of powders in specific containers, one for sugar that would be served only on the main table, another for salt that would exclusively season the meat intended for the Thornfield family. The dosage was calculated not to kill immediately, but to start a process that would complete hours later, when any connection with the meal would be beyond suspicion. While working, Sarah murmured words in a language that his grandmother had secretly taught him, not as magical enchantments, but as anchors for his determination, reminders of the identity they had tried to tear it out. Rebecca's amulet hung around her neck, hidden under the simple cotton dress. In a moment of complete silence, when all Silverwood seemed suspended between one day and the other, Sarah made one last gesture. From a small wrapping of fabric, he removed 3 small objects: a button on his mother's dress, a fabric fragment that had belonged to Rebecca's clothes, and a tiny straw braided that Isaiah had made for her. He put them on the table and, for a moment, allowed a single tear to drain through his face. "Tomorrow," whispered to silence, "everything ends, and it all starts." Easter dawned with a cruel beauty about Silverwood, the rising rose sun of rose and gold, the cotton fields, while a heavy dew covered the grass as scattered diamonds. Birds sang in the magnolias that flanked the entrance of the property, and the air carried the perfume of the first flowers of spring. In the big house, the Thornfield family awoke to their private Paschal ritual. Colonel read selected biblical passages in the small chapel adjacent to the mansion, while his wife and daughters heard with expressions rehearsed of devotion. No slave was allowed in this intimate ceremony. Spirituality, like everything else in Silverwood, was rigidly segregated. In the kitchen, Sarah had worked since before dawn. His face revealed nothing but professional concentration while overseeing the preparation of the elaborate Pascal breakfast. When the family entered the dining room, it was she who personally served the special tea she had prepared, a tradition that the Colonel himself had established years earlier, relying only on Sarah's touch to the drink that began his most important day of the year. "Excellent as always, Sarah," he said casually after the first sip, without really looking at her. "The guests will start to come at noon. Make sure everything is impeccable." "Yes, Master Thornfield," said Sarah, with the perfect deference she had grown for years. Just someone who knew her deeply noticed the very light change in the rhythm of her breathing when she collected the Colonel's empty cup. The execution of Sarah's plan has unfolded throughout the day in carefully orchestrated phases, each fitting the following with the accuracy of a watch mechanism. The first phase, infiltration, began with the arrival of the guests. While elegant carriages brought Charleston's elite, Sarah remained in the kitchen, apparently absorbed in the banquet's final preparations. In fact, it supervised the implementation of the initial step, mercy, serving welcome drinks, ensuring that the Thornfield family received glasses of a special punch personally prepared by Sarah, containing the first dose of its carefully calculated mixture. The second phase, isolation, occurred naturally through the social structure of the event. The Thornfield family, as hosts, consumed food and slightly different drinks from guests, a privilege that would become their ruin. Sarah had ensured that the dishes served at the main table would receive special treatment, while the same foods intended for guests remained untouched by their preparations. The main banquet began at 2 in the afternoon, an extravagance of dishes that demonstrated both Thornfield's richness and Sarah's ability as a cook. Roasted lamb with herbs, stuffed birds, elaborate puddings and imported sweets covered the long table. The Colonel, in place of honor, spoke about divine blessings while unconsciously ingested the second dose of Sarah's poison, mixed with special sauce that accompanied only his portion of meat. Augusta Thornfield, famous for her refined taste, praised her exclusive dessert prepared for her, a pudding decorated with crystallized flowers under which the third dose of the lethal mixture was hidden. Elizabeth and Catherine, in turn, deleted themselves with imported chocolates, in which Sarah had injected skillfully small amounts of her potion through microscopic holes in the shells. As the afternoon advanced and the banquet extended with music and conversations, the first symptoms began to manifest so subtly that they were initially ignored. The Colonel attributed its slight dizziness to the wine. Augusta mentioned a strange feeling of heat that associated with the salon temperature. Elizabeth noticed a tingling on the lips that he thought was a reaction to the exotic seasoning of the last dish. It was Catherine, the youngest, who first showed more serious signs. During an execution to the piano, his hand suddenly failed on the keys. She got up, confused, and staggered before she supported herself in a nearby chair. "Just a little dizzy," she smiled at the worried guests. "Maybe the emotion of the day." The crucial moment of execution occurred when the Colonel, rising to propose a toast, felt the first violent contraction in his stomach. The crystal glass escaped his fingers suddenly rigid, shattering on the floor in a sound that seemed to echo throughout Silverwood. Augusta, trying to help him, was hit by similar seizures, falling to his knees next to her husband. Panic settled among the guests when the two daughters Thornfield also began showing serious symptoms, Elizabeth vomiting violently, Catherine writhing on the floor with spasms. Amid chaos, no one noticed Sarah by calmly watching from the kitchen door. His face is a mask of proper concern that did not reach his eyes. "Seek the doctor," shouted the guests while servants ran in all directions. However, the nearest doctor was 2 hours away, and Sarah knew precisely how long he would take until the symptoms became irreversible. While the guests and household slaves focused on the drama that unfolded in the dining room, silently Tobias positioned the previously prepared cart at the back of the property. Jeremiah, in turn, created an additional distraction on the way by fire, a small warehouse, attracting part of his attention away from the big house. The climax of the execution came when Colonel Thornfield, in his last moments of lucidity, stared directly at Sarah. For a fleeting moment, recognition shone in his eyes. Not just betrayal, but of something deeper. The late understanding that the power he believed absolute always had limits. Her last words, almost inaudible amid her family, were directed to her. You can't. Sarah approached him then under the pretext of offering help and whispered back, "By Rebecca, for all of us." Then, with the same calm that he had kept throughout the process, he put in the hand of the dying colonel the little charm of accounts that had belonged to his sister, a final signature for his act of justice. When the last Thornfield finally silenced, a strange void filled Silverwood. The guests, many also featuring light symptoms, calculated by Sarah to cause discomfort without real danger, began in panic, taking stories of a mysterious affliction that had decimated the Thornfield on their own Easter table. Sarah remained in the big house to the end, moving between the bodies like a shadow, checking already silenced pulses, closing eyes that no longer saw. His face showed neither triumph nor remorse, only the calm finish of a long and necessary task. When the night fell on Silverwood, a silence unlike any other in its history involved the plantation. The emptiness left by the abrupt death of the entire ruler family created a power gap that Sarah had predicted and planned to explore. Under the cloak of darkness and widespread confusion, Sarah gathered household slaves in the big hall of the house that had been forbidden for them so long, except as silent servers. There, where hours earlier the Thornfield family had made her last feast, Sarah spoke clearly and authority, no longer as the submissive cook, but as the architect of a liberation. "What happened today?" she said to the group of astonished faces. "It was not the work of chance or God. It was my hand guided by the blood of all our brothers and sisters who suffered and died here." His announcement, instead of provoking panic, was received with a silence loaded with collective understanding. Sarah then explained the next step, the exodus. Not a disordered escape that would lead to the right capture, but an organized retreat that had meticulously planned. "We have a few hours until the authorities arrive. Each has a choice to make now." Sarah's plan divided slaves into 3 groups. Those who would immediately depart north through the clandestine network that Tobias had contacted, those who preferred to try to find family members sold to other plantations in the region, and a few, especially the elderly, who chose to stay and tell a carefully built story about a mysterious disease that had affected the family. In Casa Grande's kitchen, now transformed into an operations center, Sarah organized a closing ritual. Around the great stove where meals had prepared for their oppressors for 2 decades, slaves gathered small personal effects, symbols of their suppressed identities. One by one, they cast these objects into the flames, while Sarah recited words in a language that few understood there, but whose meaning all felt. A purification, a break-o, a new beginning. The fire, an element that had served the House of Lords, now became an instrument of liberation. The flames grew, fed by documents from the Colonel Library, titles of ownership, slave purchase records, the punishment book he kept with meticulous accuracy. Fire consumed not only paper, but an entire system. As the flames climbed, internal resistances manifested themselves. Some slaves, conditioned by fear over entire lives, hesitated by the perspective of the escape. "What if they catch us?" a young mother asked, squeezing her baby against her chest. Sarah offered no false guarantees, only naked truth. "Some of us will not come, but our children will not be born slaves." Under the supervision of Jeremiah, now transformed into sentinel armed with the foreman's own weapons, the freed column began to form at the back of the property. First the younger and most strong, who would pave the way, then families with children. Lastly, Sarah and the few that would form the rear, erasing traces and creating false clues. Before leaving, Sarah performed one last act. He returned to the dining room alone where the bodies of the Thornfield family awaited discovery. From the pocket of his apron, he removed 4 small cloth dolls, rudimentary but recognizable, representations of the 4 Thornfield. He put them carefully in the hands of the dead, the rigid fingers closed around the dolls as in a last macabre hug. This gesture was not just a final challenge act, but a coded message for those who could read. The dolls, made with the tissues of Silverwood's own slaves, silently declared authorship and the reason for the act. It was Sarah's signature, Her claim of responsibility that would remain as a puzzle to the authorities, but as a clear symbol for slaves throughout the region. As he last leaving the mansion, Sarah stopped on the porch from where the colonel used to supervise his property. He looked at the horizon where the first rays of the nascent moon illuminated the fields that had drunk the sweat and blood of generations. The poetic image of his clipped silhouette against the night, standing in the exact place where before only gentlemen they could be, would then be remembered by the few witnesses as the true moment Silverwood ceased to exist, as it had been conceived. The news of the death of the Thornfield family spread through South Carolina as fire in dry straw. Official reports initially pointed to accidental poisoning by wild mushrooms or spoiled preserves, convenient explanations that avoided the panic of suggesting deliberate action by slaves. However, as details of the incident reached other plantations through the telegraph and messengers, the truth began to emerge between the lines. Alarmed letters circulated between owners. "We need to consider the possibility of a new type of rebellion, more sophisticated and difficult to detect," a Charleston judge wrote to the governor. "No armed men attacking directly, but reliable servants using insidious means." The geographical expansion of fear was immediate. Plantation after plantation implemented new security measures, tastings to prove food before you, prohibition of slaves with the knowledge of herbs from working in the kitchens, redoubled surveillance over any slave that showed skills above the ordinary. However, despite these precautions, in the following weeks, similar attacks occurred on neighboring properties. Although less lethal and coordinated than Silverwood's, they followed a recognizable pattern: partial poisoning, fires in specific structures, subtle sabotage in plantations' mechanisms. None of them could be directly linked to Sarah, which at that time was already advancing to the north with their group, but they all carried the mark of their method. The term the Silverwood method first emerged in a confidential bulletin of the state militia, referring to the technique of using trust positions to attack within. Therefore, it became a broader concept among slaves in the region, going from mouth to mouth through codes and songs. Not a direct incitement to violence, but a reminder that even the most powerful could be vulnerable if the resistance were sufficiently patient and cunning. Among the owners, panic manifested itself in contradictory forms. Some resorted to even greater brutality, intensifying punishments and reducing any small freedom previously granted. Others, more pragmatic, began to rethink their total dependence on domestic slaves, especially in functions related to family food and health. For slaves who remained, Sarah's immediate legacy was dual: hope and intensified repression. The stories that circulated on and LA, some factuals, others already amplified in mythical proportions, provided an alternative narrative to that of inevitable submission. At the same time, the fear of you was translated into constant surveillance and exemplary punishments for any suspicious behavior. One of the deepest and most lasting effects of the Silverwood method was the destabilization of the confidence that supported the slave system, the mechanism that allowed few controlling many dependent not only on brute force, but also on the belief in the forced loyalty of those who served most intimately. When this premise was shaken, small cracks began to appear in the seemingly monolithic structure of slavery. As an abolitionist pastor recorded in his diary after visiting the region, the true power of what happened in Silverwood is not just in the ladies, but in the planted fear. For the first time, I see gentlemen looking at their own domestic slaves and wondering what those whose thoughts have always ignored. The official response to Silverwood incident and subsequent events was not long before. Within weeks, the governor of South Carolina authorized the formation of a special force of the state militia dedicated exclusively to the capture of Sarah and his closest accomplices, Tobias, Mercy, and Jeremiah. Posters with detailed descriptions were distributed throughout the southeast region, offering substantial rewards. Sarah's face, recreated from descriptions of Silverwood survivors, has become one of the most sought after in state history. The illustration showed a woman of severe expression, penetrating eyes, and characteristics that deliberately made her more threatening than she really was. A visual demonization that served the purpose of justifying the relentless hunt. The siege strategy was meticulously executed. Patrols were established in each main intersection, especially on the known routes of the Underground Railway that helped fugitive slaves reach free states. Patrol boats intensified river surveillance, while informants were recruited in free black communities with promises of rewards or veiled threats. For almost 3 months, Sarah and her group were able to avoid capture, using alternative routes and separating into smaller units when needed. They reached Virginia and were just days from Pennsylvania, and the theoretical freedom that a non-Slavagist state offered when betrayal finally occurred. A traveling merchant, recognizing Tobias of one of the reward posters, warned local authorities. In the small town of Oak Ridge, Virginia, the militia surrounded the barn where the group rested after weeks of night trip. What followed was later described as a disproportionate battle, but led with fierce determination by the fugitives. Jeremiah was the first to fall, hit while covering the escape of a group of women and children. Its last action was to burning part of the barn, creating a smoke curtain that allowed many to escape. Mercy was captured alive, but she chose the absolute silence. Neither torture nor promises of mercy made her reveal the whereabouts of those who had managed to flee. Tobias and Sarah, along with 5 others, was entrenched in a small forest cabin during the final confrontation. For almost a full day, the militiamen kept at a distance, using the few weapons they had been able to get during the journey. One by one, the fugitives were hit or captured, until only Sarah remained. The versions about their final moments vary according to the source. The official militia report states that it was captured while trying to mix some kind of poison, faithful to its method to the end. Oral reports transmitted among freed slave communities tell a different story. Sarah, seeing himself surrounded and without escape, would have voluntarily ingested the same poison he had used against the Thornfield, denying the persecutors the satisfaction of their capture or public execution. What is certainly known is that his last words, recorded by a militia lieutenant and later published as warning, have become a symbol of resistance. You can kill me, but they cannot kill what I planted. In each kitchen, in each plantation, in each cup of tea served by slave hands, my spirit will be. The tragic greatness of his final resistance impressed even some of his persecutors. A militia sergeant wrote in private correspondence, "We faced not a common fugitive slave, but a strategist who was born in other circumstances could have commanded armies. His capture does not bring the expected relief, only the unsettling feeling that we witness something whose repercussions do not yet understand." In the decades that followed Sarah's death, her story gradually became current news into live legend. In slave and ex-slave communities, oral reports preserved and expanded their actions, often adapting them to the symbolic needs of each new generation that faced their own battles for dignity and freedom. Stories circulated on domestic slaves who had served alongside Sarah in Silverwood, and then spread her knowledge of herbs and poisons through other plantations. Some claimed that she had documented her techniques in a small ciphered recipe book, secretly passed among trusted cooks. Although never confirmed, the mere rumor of the existence of this document caused waves of panic among slave owners for years. Mysterious objects associated with Sarah gained almost mystical status. Small cloth dolls similar to those she had left with her victims became secret talismans among domestic slaves, not necessarily as a threat of violence, but as a symbol of silent resistance. A simple charm of accounts, similar to the Rebecca, became a secret identifier for members of the Underground Railway. Folk songs emerged, encoding Sarah's story in seemingly innocent letters that could be sung even under surveillance. The Silverwood Cook became progressively more elaborate with each generation, with verses that celebrated their intelligence and determination while transmitted practical lessons of disguised resistance as simple entertainment. In the decades after the Civil War, Sarah's story gained a new dimension. Former slaves who achieved literacy began to document oral traditions, and some of the first reports written about the Silverwood Avenger emerged in black community newspapers. These narratives often contrast with the official versions that had portrayed Sarah as an example of the inherent danger of educating slaves. Discreet pilgrimages to where Silverwood had existed became a tradition among certain black families of South Carolina. Even after the vegetation complained the ruins, visitors left small tax herbs tied with tape or simply stacked stones, in recognition not only to the tragedy, but to the determination that Sarah symbolized. In the following century, the academic debate versus popular memory crystallized in contrasting perspectives. White historians traditionally classified the incident of Silverwood as a domestic massacre or violent rebellion, as Black academics pioneers such as W.E.B. Du Bois reinterpreted Sarah's actions as a strategic resistance against a fundamentally violent system. In communities that traced direct lineage to the slaves who escaped thanks to Sarah's plan, his legacy remained particularly alive. Families kept relics passed through generations, a piece of fabric supposedly from their dress, a spoon that would have belonged to Silverwood's kitchen, pages of diaries held by those who completed the journey to the north. The final symbol of Sarah's history, transmitted through centuries, is not the violence of her revenge, but the alchemical transformation she represented. A woman who, reduced to the condition of property, has converted knowledge into power, apparent submission into strategic resistance, and her own catalyst suffering for the freedom of others. As one of his indirect descendants wrote in a poem published in 1920, "From the ashes of Silverwood we do not regret the fire, but we celebrate the seeds that the heat aroused. In the previously sterile soil, now fertile with memory, a woman who, when nothing left, found everything he needed." If you watch so far, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Sarah's story touched her heart. Share so that Sarah's memory is never forgotten.